He grabbed my wrist so hard it bruised. I was his new commanding officer. I know that sounds insane. Let me tell you how I got there. I was 28 years old but looked about 19, which meant people constantly assumed I was too young for whatever job I had. I got carded at R-rated movies. Bartenders asked for 2 forms of ID. And cops at new precincts always thought I was someone's daughter dropping off lunch. That Friday, I walked into the precinct 3 days before my official start date to drop off some paperwork and get my locker assignment. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old sweat, with that weird mix of disinfectant trying to cover up something worse. I approached the front desk where a bored officer sat reading a newspaper, not even looking up when I cleared my throat. I told him I needed to speak with Captain Reynolds about my assignment, and he just pointed toward the back without raising his eyes from the sports section. I walked through the bullpen where about a dozen officers sat at metal desks covered in files and coffee cups. Most of them ignored me completely. A few looked up with mild curiosity, probably wondering if I was lost. One older guy with gray hair and sergeant stripes smiled in a way that made my skin crawl, like he was already sizing me up for something. He stood up from his desk and walked toward me, moving into my space way too fast. He asked if I needed help finding someone, his breath smelling like cigarettes and mint gum trying to hide it. I stepped back and said I was looking for Captain Reynolds, keeping my voice professional and steady. He moved closer again, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberate. He told me the captain was busy and maybe he could help me instead, his eyes traveling down my body in a way that made me want to punch him. I pulled out my badge to show him I was a cop, not some random civilian, but he just laughed and grabbed my wrist before I could hold it up properly. His fingers dug into my skin hard enough that I knew it would leave marks. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and told me that little girls who play dress up with their daddy's badge should go home before they get hurt. The other officers in the room went silent, watching, and not one of them said a word to stop him. I tried to pull my wrist free, but his grip got tighter, his thumb pressing into the pulse point until pain shot up my arm. He smiled wider, enjoying my discomfort, and asked if I wanted to see what real police work looked like, or if I should run along and let the grown-ups handle things. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I opened my mouth to tell him to let go, to show him my actual sergeant stripes, to do something other than stand there frozen. Then a door slammed open behind me and a voice cut through the room like a gunshot. The captain stood in his office doorway, his face red with anger, asking what the hell was going on in his precinct. Every officer in the room suddenly found something fascinating on their desk to look at. The guy holding my wrist dropped it immediately, stepping back like I had burned him instead of the other way around. A red mark circled my wrist where his fingers had been, already starting to darken into what would definitely bruise by tomorrow. I pulled my badge out again, holding it up high so everyone in the room could see the sergeant stripes clearly displayed on the leather. My voice came out steadier than I felt when I said I was Sergeant Miller and I started Monday. The color drained from the guy's face so fast he looked like he might pass out right there in the middle of the bullpen. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out, his hands shaking at his sides. He fumbled with his own badge, trying to unclip it from his belt to show the captain, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The badge fell from his trembling hands and clattered across the floor, the metal making a sharp ringing sound in the dead silent room. Sweat poured down his temples even though the precinct was cold, and he kept trying to form words that wouldn't come. The captain's expression could have frozen hell as he looked from the guy to me and back again. He pointed at his office and said one word that somehow contained all his rage. Now. Then he looked at the other officers who had been watching the whole thing like it was entertainment, telling them they were all coming too, everyone who thought this was funny or acceptable. 6 officers filed past me with their heads down, not making eye contact, their faces ranging from pale to bright red with shame or anger or both. I stood alone in the lobby while voices rose behind the captain's closed door, my wrist throbbing where that guy had grabbed me. The desk officer who had ignored me earlier finally looked up from his paperwork, his face pale, and asked quietly if I needed ice or wanted to file a formal complaint. I told him maybe on the ice and I needed to think about the complaint. He nodded and disappeared into a back room, returning with a plastic bag full of ice cubes wrapped in a thin towel. I pressed it against my wrist, the cold helping with the pain, but not with the sick feeling in my stomach. 20 minutes passed while I sat in a plastic chair in the lobby, listening to muffled yelling through the captain's door. Finally, the door opened and the captain emerged, his face still tight with anger, asking me to step into his office while the other officers waited outside. His office was small and cluttered with files and commendations on the walls, a desk covered in paperwork, and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss." He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk and close the door behind us. He apologized for what happened, his voice tired and frustrated, explaining this was exactly the kind of behavior he was brought in to eliminate from the precinct. He had been captain for only 6 months, transferred in specifically because the department knew the culture here was toxic and needed someone willing to make hard changes. He asked if I wanted to press charges or file an official complaint, making it clear he would support whatever decision I made and would not let anyone retaliate against me for speaking up. I sat there looking at my wrist, at the bruises already forming in the perfect shape of that guy's fingers, and told him I needed time to think about it. He nodded and said the offer stood indefinitely, that he had already documented everything he witnessed and taken statements from several officers who saw what happened. I left the precinct 30 minutes later and sat in my car in the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The way that guy touched me, grabbed me, threatened me, it kept playing on repeat in my head like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. I felt angry at myself for freezing instead of fighting back immediately, for not pulling away harder, for letting him see he scared me. I drove home and spent the rest of Friday trying not to think about Monday, about walking into that precinct as their new sergeant, about having to work with people who watched me get assaulted and did nothing. That weekend I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I did what I always do when I need to feel in control. I researched. I pulled up everything I could find on the guy who grabbed me, whose name I learned was Gareth Malone. 19 years with the department, multiple commendations for bravery, 2 medals for going above and beyond in dangerous situations. On paper, he looked like a model officer, someone the department was proud of, someone they put on recruiting posters. It made me wonder how many other incidents were buried or were ignored over the years, how many other women he had grabbed or threatened or worse. Monday morning arrived too fast. I put on my uniform, checking my reflection in the mirror to make sure I looked professional, and like someone who deserved the sergeant stripes on my shoulders despite being 5'3". I arrived at the precinct 30 minutes early, finding the parking lot nearly empty except for a few early shift officers heading inside. The desk officer from Friday stood up when I walked through the front doors, nodding at me with what looked like actual respect instead of the bored dismissal from before. He pulled out a clipboard and pointed to where I needed to sign in, his voice quiet when he told me that Malone got suspended pending investigation, and that several officers caught discipline for their part in what happened. I signed my name on the log sheet while he explained where my locker was located and which briefing room the captain wanted me in for roll call. Other officers moved through the lobby around us, some glancing over with curiosity, others pretending not to notice me at all. The building felt different from Friday, less hostile but still wary, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. I thanked the desk officer and headed toward the locker room, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I found my locker easily enough, the metal door already labeled with my name and badge number. Inside, someone had left a fresh uniform shirt still in plastic and a copy of the precinct handbook. I changed quickly, checking my appearance in the small mirror stuck to the inside of the locker door. The sergeant's stripes looked foreign on my shoulders still, like they belonged to someone else. I closed the locker and made my way to the briefing room where morning roll call was about to start. The room went silent when I walked in, about 20 officers sitting in rows of chairs facing the front podium. Some looked at me with open curiosity, others with what might have been resentment, a few with blank expressions that gave nothing away. The captain stood at the podium shuffling papers, looking up when I entered and gesturing for me to take a seat in the front row. He called the room to order and went through the usual announcements about shift assignments and ongoing cases before introducing me to everyone. His voice was professional and firm when he said I was Sergeant Miller and that I came with strong recommendations from my previous department. The mandatory acknowledgments came back flat and unenthusiastic, just officers saying yes sir because they had to, not because they wanted to. I could feel the tension in the room like something physical, pressing down on everyone, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Some officers were mad at me for causing trouble with Malone. You could see it in how they sat with their arms crossed and jaws tight. Others seemed curious about whether I could actually do the job, or if I was just someone who got promoted too fast because of politics or quotas or whatever excuse they wanted to use. The captain finished roll call and started reading out patrol assignments, pairing officers up for the day shift. When he got to my name, he paired me with a veteran detective named Daryl McMillan, who had 23 years on the force according to the captain's introduction. Daryl stood up from his seat in the back row, a tall black man with gray at his temples and tired eyes that had seen too much. He nodded at me without smiling, his face giving nothing away about what he thought of being assigned to babysit the new sergeant. We walked out to the parking lot together in silence, the morning sun already hot even though it was barely 8. Daryl drove us in an unmarked sedan that smelled like old French fries and air freshener trying to cover up cigarette smoke. He kept his eyes on the road while we pulled out of the lot, not saying anything for the first few blocks. Then he started asking me questions about procedure and local ordinances, stuff that any sergeant should know cold. He asked about response protocols for armed suspects, about proper evidence handling, about when to call for backup versus handling situations ourselves. I answered each question correctly, adding context from my previous department where relevant, explaining how we handled similar situations there. He nodded after each answer but didn't offer any feedback, just moved on to the next question. We drove through residential neighborhoods where kids played in yards and people sat on porches drinking coffee. Daryl kept testing me, throwing out scenarios and asking how I would handle them, watching my face while I talked through my reasoning. After about an hour of this, he finally spoke something that wasn't a test question, telling me that the precinct had problems with how things were done before, and that change was hard for people who liked the old ways. I said I understood that, but also that some things needed to change if they were wrong. He nodded slowly at that, like maybe I had passed some kind of test he was running. The radio crackled with a domestic disturbance call about 3 blocks from our location, dispatch giving an address where neighbors reported shouting and breaking glass. Daryl looked at me and asked if I wanted to take lead on this one, his tone suggesting this was another test. I said yes, and he drove us to the address, a small house with peeling paint and toys scattered across the front lawn. We could hear yelling from inside before we even got out of the car. A man's voice loud and angry, a woman's voice crying. Daryl pulled his radio and told dispatch we were on scene, then looked at me waiting to see what I would do. I approached the front door and knocked hard, identifying myself as police and asking whoever was inside to open up. The yelling stopped for a second, then the door flew open and a man stumbled out, drunk even though it was morning, his eyes red and unfocused. He started yelling at us about how this was his house and we had no right to be there, his breath smelling like whiskey and his hands balled into fists. Behind him, I could see a woman with a bloody lip holding a kid who looked about 5. The situation was escalating fast, the husband getting more aggressive, stepping toward me like he wanted to intimidate me with his size. I kept my voice calm and steady, telling him we just wanted to make sure everyone was okay, and that nobody needed to get arrested if he could just calm down. He kept yelling about his rights and how his wife was a liar and how we needed to leave his property. I could see Daryl watching me from the side, his hand near his weapon but not on it, letting me handle this but ready to step in if needed. I kept talking to the husband, using his name that the woman had called out, making eye contact, keeping my body language non-threatening but firm. I told him I understood he was upset, but that yelling wasn't going to help anyone, and that we could talk about this calmly. It took maybe 10 minutes of this, going back and forth while he slowly came down from whatever rage had him wound up. Finally, he sat down on the front steps and put his head in his hands, the fight going out of him all at once. The woman came outside with the kid, and I took her statement while Daryl kept an eye on the husband. She said he had been drinking since last night and got mad about something stupid, threw a plate at the wall, pushed her when she tried to leave. The kid buried his face in her shoulder, too scared to look at any of us. I asked if she wanted to press charges and she shook her head, saying she just wanted him to sleep it off somewhere else for the night. We arranged for the husband to stay with his brother, making sure he understood that if we got called back here there would be consequences. Daryl and I drove away once everything was settled, the woman and kid safe inside with the doors locked. Daryl nodded at me while we got back in the car, the first sign of approval I had gotten from him all day. He said I handled that well, that some officers would have escalated instead of de-escalating, that it took patience and skill to talk someone down like that. Back at the precinct during our lunch break, Daryl told other officers that I handled the domestic call well and knew my stuff. It was the first time anyone had vouched for me here, the first crack in the wall of resistance. A few officers nodded when he said it, like maybe they were willing to give me a chance now that someone they respected had spoken up for me. The rest of the shift passed without major incidents, just routine patrol and paperwork. When I got back to the locker room at the end of my shift, 3 female officers were waiting outside my locker, looking nervous and uncertain like they weren't sure if they should be there. The tallest one, Annika Sharma, according to her name tag, asked if we could talk somewhere private. I led them to an empty briefing room and closed the door, gesturing for them to sit down at the table. Annika looked at the other 2 women before speaking, her hands twisted together in her lap. She told me that Malone harassed her 2 years ago, that he made inappropriate comments about her body, touched her shoulders and arms when he didn't need to, followed her to her car after shifts. She reported it to her supervisor, who told her to handle it herself and not make waves because Malone was well connected in the department. Her voice shook while she talked, like saying it out loud made it real again in a way that hurt. The second officer, Chloe Redmond, shared that Malone cornered her in the evidence room last year, pressed his body against hers while reaching for a file on a shelf above her head, his breath hot on her neck while he pretended it was an accident. She didn't report it because she saw what happened to Annika when she spoke up, knew that nothing would change and she would just make herself a target. The third officer, Lydia Winters, said she witnessed both incidents, but felt powerless to help because speaking up would have meant going against senior officers who protected Malone. She apologized for not being braver, her eyes filling with tears. I told her that coming forward now took real courage, that I understood how hard it was to speak up when the system was designed to protect people like Malone instead of people like us. I asked if they would be willing to make official statements to Internal Affairs. My voice stayed steady while I explained that their testimonies could establish a pattern of behavior that makes the case against Malone much stronger. Annika looked at Chloe, then Lydia, their faces tight with fear and something that looked like hope mixed together. They sat there for what felt like forever, none of them speaking, just looking at each other like they were having a silent conversation about whether this was really worth the risk. Annika finally nodded and said my example gave them hope that someone might actually listen this time. Chloe and Lydia agreed right after, their voices quiet but firm. I thanked them and told them I would set up the meetings with Internal Affairs as soon as possible. We left the briefing room together and went our separate ways in the parking lot, each of us carrying the weight of what we had just agreed to do. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone for 20 minutes before I finally called the captain at home. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice tired like I had woken him up even though it was only 9. I told him about the 3 officers who came forward, giving him their names and brief details about what each one had experienced. He went quiet for so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then he said he suspected Malone was not a first-time offender, but had no proof until now. His voice got rough when he thanked me for creating an environment where victims feel safe reporting. He said he would contact Internal Affairs first thing in the morning and get investigators assigned immediately. I hung up and sat there in the dark, my hands shaking, wondering if I had just made things better or worse for all of us. The next morning, an Internal Affairs investigator named Alina Carr arrived at the precinct before roll call. She was tall with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing when she looked at you. The captain brought her to the briefing room where Annika, Chloe, Lydia, and I were waiting. She introduced herself and laid out her notebook and recorder on the table, her movements careful and professional. She interviewed each of us separately, taking detailed statements that lasted over an hour each. She asked follow-up questions that showed she actually understood what harassment looks like, not just checking boxes on a form. When she asked about specific dates and times, about who else was present, about what exactly was said and done, I could tell she was building a real case instead of just going through the motions. She took my statement last and asked me to describe everything from the moment I walked into the precinct on Friday. I walked her through every detail, from the desk officer dismissing me to Malone grabbing my wrist to the captain witnessing it all. She nodded while she wrote, her pen moving fast across the pages. Word spread through the precinct before lunch that multiple officers had accused Malone of harassment. I could feel the atmosphere shift the moment I walked into the bullpen for my afternoon patrol assignment. Some officers looked relieved, like they had been waiting years for someone to finally speak up. They nodded at me when I passed their desks, their faces showing respect I had not seen before. Others closed ranks and muttered to each other in corners, their voices low and angry. I heard fragments of conversations about witch hunts and political correctness ruining the department. One group of older officers stopped talking completely when I walked past, their silence heavier than any words. Daryl found me by my locker and said the precinct was splitting into camps, those who wanted change, and those who wanted things to stay exactly how they had always been. During roll call the next morning, an older officer with gray hair and a face like weathered leather made a pointed comment about how some people use their gender to get ahead instead of earning respect through real police work. His eyes were on me when he said it, making sure everyone knew exactly who he meant. The room went dead silent, every officer frozen in their seats waiting to see what would happen. The captain stood up from his desk at the front of the room, his face turning red. He said anyone who has a problem with female officers can find employment elsewhere, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He stared at the older officer until the man looked away, then continued with assignments like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everyone could feel it. The captain had drawn a line and made it clear which side he was on. I focused on doing my job well and building relationships with officers who seemed open to working with me. Daryl introduced me to other veterans who judged people by their actions rather than their gender. There was Gomez, who had 16 years on patrol, Chung, who worked narcotics, and Washington, who ran the evidence room. They invited me to sit with them during breaks, and included me in their conversations about cases and department politics. Slowly, I started to find my footing in the precinct culture, learning who I could trust and who I needed to watch carefully. I handled my calls professionally, backed up other officers when they needed help, and never complained about getting the difficult assignments. Some officers started asking for my input during briefings, actually listening when I spoke instead of dismissing me because of my age or gender. 2 weeks after the incident, Alina Carr completed her investigation and presented her findings to the captain and police chief. I was not in the meeting, but Daryl told me later what happened. The evidence was overwhelming. 4 separate victims with consistent stories, multiple witnesses who saw Malone's behavior over the years, and a pattern spanning his entire career that the department failed to address. The chief looked sick while Alina walked through her findings, realizing how badly the department had failed to protect its own officers. She had documented everything, every incident that was reported and ignored, every complaint that disappeared into filing cabinets, every supervisor who told victims to handle it themselves. The report was over 40 pages long with witness statements and documentation that made it impossible to deny what Malone had been doing for years. Malone was officially terminated from the police department for sexual harassment, assault, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His union representative, Lawrence Moss, initially fought the termination and filed grievances claiming the investigation was biased. But after reviewing the evidence and realizing the case was unwinnable, Moss withdrew his support and told Malone he was on his own. The termination went through within a week, faster than anyone expected. Malone cleaned out his locker on a Tuesday afternoon when most officers were out on patrol, escorted by security like he was a criminal instead of someone who had worn the uniform for 19 years. I was not there to see it, but heard from others that he left without saying a word to anyone, his face blank like he could not believe this was really happening to him. Some of Malone's friends in the department were angry and blamed me for ruining a good cop's career over what they called harmless flirting. One officer bumped into me hard in the hallway outside the locker room, his shoulder hitting mine with enough force to knock me sideways. He muttered something under his breath about watching my back, his voice too low for anyone else to hear, but loud enough that I caught every word. I kept walking like nothing happened, but my heart was racing, wondering if this was just the beginning of retaliation. That night, I checked my car before getting in, looking underneath and in the back seat like I was being paranoid. But after what happened with Malone, paranoid felt like the smart way to be. The captain called a mandatory department-wide meeting about workplace conduct the next morning, pulling officers from all shifts to fill the briefing room. He stood at the front with his arms crossed and made it clear that harassment of any kind would result in immediate termination. He used Malone's case as an example of what happens when officers abuse their power and the department fails to act. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats while he talked, probably wondering if their own behavior would be next under the microscope. Others nodded along, looking relieved that someone was finally addressing problems everyone knew existed, but nobody wanted to talk about. The captain ended by saying the department was changing whether people liked it or not, and anyone who could not adapt to treating their colleagues with basic respect should start looking for work elsewhere. I opened my locker the next morning and a folded piece of paper fell out, landing on my boot. I picked it up and unfolded it, reading the words printed in block letters. "You made enemies. Watch your back on patrol." My hands went cold and I looked around the locker room, but everyone nearby was focused on getting ready for shift. I folded the note carefully and walked straight to the captain's office, knocking twice before he called me in. I handed him the note without saying anything and watched his jaw tighten as he read it. He picked up his phone and called Alina Carr, telling her to come back to the precinct immediately because there was a retaliation situation that needed investigation. She arrived within an hour and took the note into evidence, photographing it and placing it in a clear plastic bag. She interviewed everyone who had access to the locker room and checked the sign-in logs to see who was present when the note could have been placed. The investigation took 3 days, but Alina eventually traced it back to one of the officers who had been disciplined for laughing during my harassment, a guy named Peters who worked night shift and had been in the locker room early that morning. The captain called Peters into his office with Alina present and confronted him with the evidence, and Peters tried to deny it at first, but eventually admitted he left the note because he thought I was destroying the department's reputation. The captain's face turned red, and he told Peters that threatening a fellow officer was grounds for immediate termination, but he was going to give him one chance to keep his job. Peters received a formal written warning that went into his permanent file and was ordered to complete mandatory sensitivity training within 30 days or face termination. The captain called another department-wide meeting the next morning and stood at the front of the briefing room with his arms crossed. He held up a copy of the warning letter and made it clear to every officer present that retaliation against me or any of the victims would be treated exactly as seriously as the original harassment. He said anyone who had a problem with that could turn in their badge right now and save everyone the trouble. Nobody moved or spoke, but I could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting as officers realized this was not going away, and the captain meant every word he said. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the hostile looks and whispered comments started to decrease. Officers who had been cold to me began nodding when I passed them in the hallway. During briefings, more people listened when I spoke instead of rolling their eyes or looking away. I handled a domestic violence call where the suspect tried to fight his way past me, and I took him down cleanly using proper technique without anyone getting hurt. Word spread through the precinct about how I handled the situation, and several officers who had been skeptical started treating me with actual respect. A veteran named Gomez stopped me in the parking lot one afternoon and said he misjudged me based on the controversy instead of giving me a fair chance. He apologized and asked if we could start over, and I shook his hand and told him I appreciated that. Slowly, the precinct culture started to change as officers realized the captain was serious about creating a professional environment where everyone was judged by their competence rather than their gender. Annika found me after shift one evening and asked if I wanted to grab coffee with her, Chloe and Lydia. We met at a diner near the precinct and spent 2 hours talking about the challenges of being female officers in a profession dominated by men. Chloe shared stories about male officers who assumed she could not handle physical confrontations, and Lydia talked about supervisors who passed her over for good assignments because they thought she would get emotional under pressure. We realized we all faced similar problems, but had been dealing with them alone, and Annika suggested we should meet regularly to support each other and share strategies for handling difficult situations. We agreed to meet every 2 weeks after shift, creating an informal support group where we could talk honestly about the ongoing fallout from coming forward and the daily challenges of proving ourselves in an environment that questioned our abilities. A district patrol supervisor named Estelle Boyd called me a few weeks later and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch. She was in her mid-40s with 15 years of experience and a reputation for being tough but fair. We sat in a quiet booth at a sandwich shop, and she told me she went through similar challenges when she was promoted to supervisor years ago. She said male officers tested her constantly, trying to find weaknesses they could exploit to undermine her authority. She taught me how to navigate precinct politics without compromising my integrity, explaining which battles were worth fighting and which ones to let go. She introduced me to other senior officers who judged people by their work rather than their gender, helping me build alliances with people who had real influence in the department. She became my mentor, calling me every few weeks to check in and offering advice when I faced difficult situations. 3 months into my assignment, I had earned the respect of most officers through consistent competence and fair leadership. I responded to calls professionally, backed up my team members when they needed help, and never asked anyone to do something I would not do myself. When a rookie officer made a mistake during a traffic stop that could have turned dangerous, I pulled him aside privately and walked him through what he should have done differently instead of embarrassing him in front of other officers. When Daryl needed backup on a robbery call, I was first to arrive and helped him clear the building room by room until we found the suspects hiding in a back office. I treated everyone with respect regardless of their rank or how they initially treated me, and gradually people started responding in kind. Daryl caught me in the hallway one morning before roll call and said I was the best sergeant he had worked with in 10 years. Coming from him, that meant everything because he did not give compliments easily, and had seen dozens of supervisors come and go. Other veterans started seeking my input during briefings, asking my opinion on cases and actually listening to my suggestions instead of dismissing them. The precinct received a commendation from the police chief for improved workplace culture and increased reporting of harassment incidents. The captain stood in front of the entire department during a ceremony and credited the change to officers like me who refused to accept the old way of doing things and had the courage to speak up when they saw problems. He said creating a professional environment required everyone to hold themselves and each other accountable, and the precinct was finally becoming the kind of place where good officers wanted to work. I led a training session for new recruits about recognizing and reporting workplace harassment, using my experience as a case study without going into identifying details that would violate anyone's privacy. The recruits asked thoughtful questions about how to handle situations where they witnessed inappropriate behavior and seemed genuinely committed to maintaining professional standards. 6 months after the incident, I went to the mall with Annika to shop for new boots because my old ones were falling apart. We were walking past the food court when I saw Malone standing near a kiosk wearing a tan security guard uniform instead of police blues. The moment our eyes met, his face went pale, and he ducked behind the kiosk and disappeared into the crowd of shoppers. Annika and I looked at each other and both started laughing, so hard I had to lean against the wall to catch my breath. The sight of Malone ducking behind that kiosk like a scared kid was almost too perfect after everything he put us through. Annika wiped tears from her eyes and said watching him hide in his security guard uniform made her feel powerful for the first time in years. She told me he used to make her feel so small and helpless when he cornered her in the locker room or followed her to her car after shifts. Now he was the one running away, reduced to watching shoppers instead of carrying a badge. We walked through the rest of the mall with our heads high, and I noticed Annika stood a little straighter than before. The next Monday, the captain called me into his office and closed the door behind me. He sat behind his desk and pulled out a thick folder with my name on it. He said he was recommending me for a leadership development program that prepared sergeants for lieutenant positions. The program included advanced training in management, conflict resolution, and department policy. He told me my handling of the harassment situation and the positive impact I had on precinct culture showed exactly the kind of leadership the department needed. He said most supervisors would have tried to sweep the problem under the rug to avoid controversy, but I stood up for what was right even when it made things harder. I felt my throat get tight because this was the first time someone in authority truly recognized what speaking up had cost me. I accepted the opportunity and filled out the application forms right there in his office. Walking back to my desk, I thought about how the worst experience of my career had somehow led to the best professional growth. I learned that speaking up was not just about protecting yourself, but about creating safety for everyone who came after you. 2 weeks later, Chloe found me in the parking lot after my shift ended. She was bouncing on her heels with excitement and told me she just got promoted to detective. I hugged her and congratulated her, genuinely happy to see her succeed. She pulled back and looked me straight in the eye. She said she never would have had the confidence to apply for detective if she had not seen me stand up to Malone and survive. Watching me fight back and win made her believe she could do hard things too. She told me that before I came to the precinct, she thought the only way to survive as a female officer was to keep her head down and accept whatever treatment she got. Seeing me refuse to accept that changed everything for her. Knowing my actions helped others advance their careers made everything I went through feel worthwhile. The precinct held a department meeting the following month to announce new policies. The captain stood at the front of the briefing room with representatives from Internal Affairs and Human Resources. They handed out thick packets outlining new procedures for reporting harassment allegations. The new policy required immediate reporting to Internal Affairs for any harassment complaint, with mandatory investigation within 48 hours. Supervisors who failed to report allegations or tried to handle them informally would face discipline up to and including termination. Officers would receive annual training on workplace conduct, and the captain made it clear that protecting harassers would result in serious consequences. The room was quiet as officers flipped through the packets, and I could see some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. 3 months after that, I got assigned to mentor a new female sergeant named Jennifer Torres, who was transferring in from another precinct across town. I met her on her first day and made sure it was nothing like mine. I introduced her to Daryl, Annika, Chloe, and other officers who would have her back. I walked her through the precinct layout and explained which supervisors were supportive and which ones still clung to old attitudes. I told her about the support group we had formed and invited her to join our next meeting. She looked relieved to know she had allies from day one, and I remembered how alone I felt that first week. Daryl retired after 25 years on the force, and the precinct threw him a party at a bar downtown. Half the department showed up to celebrate, and I found him near the back talking to some veterans. He pulled me aside and told me that working with me restored his faith in the department's future. He said he was getting cynical about the old boys club mentality and thought things would never change. Seeing real change happen gave him hope that the next generation of officers would be better than his. He shook my hand and told me to keep fighting the good fights. A few weeks after that, 3 officers approached me separately over the course of a week. They were the ones who bumped me in the hallway and left the threatening note in my locker. Each one apologized and said they were wrong to blame me for Malone's consequences. They admitted they were scared of change and lashed out at me because I was the easiest target instead of looking at their own part in protecting him. One of them, Peters, said he realized he had laughed at jokes about female officers for years without thinking about how that made them feel. I listened to each apology and told them I appreciated their honesty. I made it clear that creating a hostile work environment had real consequences for victims, and that fear was not an excuse for harassment. They all seemed genuinely sorry, and asked how they could make things right. I told them the best way to make amends was through good work, and treating everyone with respect going forward. Over the next few months, those 3 officers became some of my most reliable team members, showing up early for shifts and volunteering for difficult assignments. 1 year after the incident with Malone, the captain called me into his office again. He told me I was promoted to lieutenant and would oversee multiple patrol teams across 2 shifts. The promotion came with a significant pay increase and more responsibility than I ever imagined having this early in my career. The promotion felt earned rather than given, based on my performance and leadership, rather than anyone trying to make up for what happened. I signed the paperwork and walked out of his office feeling proud of how far I had come in just 12 months. Annika texted me the next morning and said she was throwing a party at Murphy's Bar downtown to celebrate my promotion. I told her she didn't need to do that, but she said it was already planned and half the precinct had confirmed they were coming. I showed up at 7 and the place was packed with officers still in uniform or just changed into street clothes. Daryl raised his beer when I walked in and people started clapping, which made my face hot. Chloe and Lydia were at a table near the back with a banner that said, "Congratulations, Lieutenant Miller," in crooked letters. Officers I barely knew came up to shake my hand and tell me I deserved it. Peters, one of the guys who used to bump me in the hallway, bought me a drink and said he was glad to see good leadership getting recognized. Even some of the older veterans who gave me cold shoulders for months were friendly now, asking about my plans for the new position. I sat with Annika and the others and realized this was the first time I felt completely comfortable in a room full of cops from my precinct. Nobody was watching me with suspicion or waiting for me to fail. They saw me as one of them now, someone who earned her place through work instead of just showing up with stripes on her sleeve. The captain found me near the bar around 9 and pulled me aside to a quieter corner. He said my promotion was about more than just my performance, though that was excellent. He told me female officers throughout the department were watching what happened with my case and my career afterward. Some of them had been harassed, but stayed quiet because they thought speaking up meant the end of their careers. Seeing me report what happened, survive the investigation, and get promoted sent a message that the department would protect people who came forward instead of punishing them. He said competence and courage mattered more than gender or politics, and my promotion proved that to everyone who doubted it. I thanked him and told him I wouldn't have made it without his support when everything first happened. He shook his head and said I did the hard part by refusing to accept treatment that should never happen to any officer. He just made sure the system worked the way it was supposed to. I spent my first month as lieutenant setting up new programs to improve how the precinct handled workplace issues. I created a mentorship system that paired experienced officers with new recruits, so nobody had to figure everything out alone like I did. Each mentor met with their assigned recruit twice a month to answer questions and help them navigate department politics. I also set up clear channels for reporting any concerns about harassment or discrimination that went straight to internal affairs, instead of through supervisors who might try to bury complaints. Every officer got a card with the reporting information and instructions on how to file anonymous tips if they witnessed something but felt scared to come forward directly. The captain approved everything and made announcements at roll call about the new systems. Some older officers grumbled about political correctness, but most people seemed relieved to have actual procedures instead of the informal mess we had before. The department tracked retention rates for female officers over the next year, and the numbers improved significantly. Women who joined the force stayed longer and reported feeling safer and more supported in exit interviews when they did leave. The chief held a press conference about the cultural improvements and credited leadership that took harassment seriously, instead of protecting bad officers. He mentioned our precinct specifically as a model for other departments trying to change their workplace culture. The local news ran a story about it and interviewed some female officers who talked about feeling respected and valued. I watched the broadcast in the break room and felt proud that speaking up about what happened to me helped create real change that protected other people. I attended a regional law enforcement conference 6 months later, where I was scheduled to present on workplace culture change. I was nervous about speaking in front of hundreds of officers from different departments, but Estelle told me my experience was valuable, and people needed to hear it. I gave my presentation about creating reporting systems and changing attitudes through training and accountability. Afterward, Estelle introduced me to female leaders from 3 other departments who were working on similar initiatives. We exchanged contact information and started a group chat where we shared resources and strategies. I realized I wasn't alone anymore, that there was a whole network of women trying to fix policing from the inside. One of them invited me to speak at her department next month, and I agreed because spreading this information felt important. Malone's name came up occasionally when older officers told stories about past cases or memorable arrests. But the tone changed completely from how people used to talk about him. Instead of praising his commendations and years of service, veterans used him as an example of what not to do. They told new recruits about officers who abused their power and got fired for it. His reputation shifted from respected veteran to cautionary tale about harassment and misconduct. Nobody defended him anymore or suggested he got a raw deal. Even his old friends stopped bringing him up except to distance themselves from his behavior. I found a letter in my department mailbox 2 months after the conference. It came from a female officer named Sarah Chang at a precinct across the city. She wrote that she heard about my case through the news coverage, and it inspired her to report her own harassment by a senior officer. She had been dealing with inappropriate comments and unwanted touching for 8 months, but stayed quiet because she thought nothing would change, and she would just make her life harder. Reading about what I went through and how the department supported me gave her courage to file a formal complaint. Her harasser was investigated and terminated after they found evidence he had done the same thing to 2 other officers. She thanked me for showing her that speaking up could lead to real change instead of just making everything worse. I wrote back and told her I was proud of her for coming forward and that she helped protect other officers by refusing to stay silent. 2 years after that first day when everything happened, I settled into my lieutenant role with a strong team that respected my leadership. I supervised 4 patrol teams across 2 shifts and had a reputation for being fair, but firm with discipline. Officers came to me with problems because they knew I would listen and help them find solutions instead of just dismissing their concerns. I still thought about that first day sometimes, about Malone grabbing my wrist and the fear I felt standing in that precinct alone. But mostly I felt proud of how I handled it and grateful for the people who supported me through everything. The bruise on my wrist faded within 2 weeks, but the changes that came from speaking up would last much longer. The precinct became a model for other departments trying to improve their workplace culture. The captain got invited to speak at conferences and training sessions about the changes we made and how they affected officer retention and morale. He always credited the officers who had courage to come forward as the real heroes of the story. He said leadership could create policies and procedures, but real change only happened when people refused to accept the old way of doing things. Other departments started copying our mentorship program and reporting systems. The chief told me privately that our precinct had the lowest harassment complaint rate in the entire city, not because people stopped reporting, but because the behavior actually decreased once everyone knew there would be consequences. I mentored 5 female sergeants now, making sure they had the support I wished I had when I started. They called me when they faced challenges with difficult officers or situations they didn't know how to handle. I helped them navigate department politics while building their confidence and teaching them to trust their judgment. One of them, Jennifer, told me she almost quit during her first month because a veteran officer kept undermining her authority in front of other cops. I walked her through different strategies for addressing it and backed her up when she confronted him directly. He stopped after that, and Jennifer grew into one of the strongest supervisors in the department. Watching these women succeed, and knowing I helped them get there made everything I went through feel worthwhile. Annika walked into my office 3 months after my promotion and dropped into the chair across from my desk. She told me the captain wanted her as my second in command if I agreed to it. I looked at her and remembered that first conversation in the empty briefing room when she was scared to speak up about what Malone did to her. Now she sat there confident and relaxed, waiting for my answer like she already knew what I would say. I told her yes before she finished asking, and watched her face break into a huge smile. We worked together better than I expected, finishing each other's thoughts during briefings and backing each other up on difficult calls. Other officers noticed how smoothly we ran things and started coming to us with problems instead of going around us to higher ranks. Annika told me one afternoon while we were doing paperwork that she never imagined feeling this comfortable in law enforcement. She said she spent years thinking she picked the wrong career because she felt out of place and unwelcome everywhere she worked. Working with me changed that completely and made her remember why she wanted to be a cop in the first place. The department sent out a memo 6 months later announcing a new policy for handling harassment complaints. Every allegation had to be reported to a supervisor immediately, and internal affairs had to start investigating within 48 hours. The policy did not mention my name or our case specifically, but I recognized details from what happened to us woven throughout the requirements. I showed the memo to Annika, and she read it twice before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. She said this policy would have protected her 2 years ago, when Malone first harassed her, and her supervisor told her to handle it herself. Now nobody could bury complaints or tell victims to stay quiet, because the system required immediate action and outside investigation. I was picking up groceries after my shift 2 years later when I saw Malone stocking shelves in the cereal aisle. He wore a blue security uniform with a grocery store logo on the chest instead of police blues. Our eyes met for just a second before he turned and walked quickly toward the back of the store. I stood there holding a box of pasta and felt nothing but pity for someone who threw away 19 years and a decent career because he could not treat people with basic respect. He used to have authority and respect from other officers. Now he stocked shelves and avoided eye contact with the cops he used to work beside. I drove home after finishing my shopping and thought about that first day when Malone grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises. That moment felt like the worst thing that could happen to me at the time. But speaking up about it led to real changes that would protect officers for years after I retired. The new harassment policy existed because we refused to stay quiet. Female officers joined the department now knowing they had clear ways to report problems and get help. That terrifying first day turned into something meaningful that made the job safer for everyone. Speaking up was the hardest thing I ever did, and also the best thing. I would do it again without hesitation, because some things are worth fighting for, no matter how scary they seem at the time.